Hi, in this video I'll talk about my template and why it is set up the way it is. Fair warning, there are some things in this template that are very specific to my personal needs, so this is not going to be the most ideal setup for everyone. I just thought it would be interesting to show you guys the way I do things and maybe you can take some inspiration from it. Quick note, I recently launched my Patreon page and you can get this template and a lot of other FL Studio goodies there, so go check it out. Link in the description. So, this is my personal template, the one I use when I write my own music. And I gotta say, templates makes life a lot easier. I've been producing music for 10 years now, and 7 of those years I did not use templates. And now that I do use templates, my workflow is just so much faster. So can't recommend templates enough if you're not already using them. Anyway, this template was originally intended for a specific album I were creating, so it has some oddities in it meant to support a specific sound. I just happened to end up making it my default template because I enjoy the workflow so much, and I have used it ever since. This template contains 8 main buses: drums, vocals, synths, keys, bass, atmosphere, effects and leads. Most of these buses are set up the same way, just normal tracks routed to their respective buses. But there are exceptions, like the drums. The drum tracks consists primarily of audio tracks, as I prefer to lay them out in the playlist. And in case you're not familiar with audio tracks, you can change the track mode of any track in the playlist. And when you choose audio track, you can select a free slot in the mixer and link that track directly to it. This way, you can drag samples right into the playlist and it will already be routed to the mixer, saving you some time and labor. Another cool thing is that any change you make to the name and color of the track also automatically gets mirrored in the mixer. Instrument tracks work similarly. You just choose a VST first and it will automatically route itself to the next available mixer track. Now, let's take a closer look at how the drums are set up in the mixer. I have 2 kick tracks directly routed to pre-drums, 5 snare tracks which are routed to its own snare bus, and 17 percussion tracks routed to percussion. Both the snare and percussion bus are routed to pre-drums, which are then routed to both dry and wet, which are finally routed to drums, where it all comes together. I promise that sounds a lot more complicated than it really is. Let's break it down. The reason I have 2 kicks is because I use kick 1 as my main kick and kick 2 as a weaker accent when I want that. For example, the reason I have 5 snare tracks is simply because I tend to layer them. On the percussion bus, I have an EQ filtering out the lows and a limiter for sidechaining. Sidechaining the percussion allows for the kick and snare to stand out from the rest of the drums, which I personally like. Then all the percussion is gathered with the kick and snare in the pre-drums bus before going to dry and wet. The dry and wet buses are for parallel processing. As you can see, the pre-drums bus is routed to both. The dry signal is untouched and just goes straight to the drums bus, while the wet signal is heavily distorted. This allows me to easily control how much crunchiness I want to apply to all my drums with just this single fader. Then finally, we have the main drums bus where everything ends up. On here, I have a very aggressive compressor, which comes from the album I mentioned earlier. Heavy compressed drums were part of the sound. I usually just leave it on when I'm laying down ideas, then I take it off when I'm mixing. And that's pretty much it for the drums, which are by far the most complicated section of this template. Moving on, we have the vocals, synths, keys, bass, atmosphere and leads, which are all mostly normal tracks routed to their respective buses. The exceptions are 2 instrument tracks, 1 synth and 1 bass track, which I'll come back to in a moment. I have a limiter on each bus except vocals and drums that I use for sidechaining. The reason I do it this way instead of just sending everything to one track is because I prefer the flexibility it gives me. For example, I find that sidechaining too much on lighter instruments like pads and other background elements makes the track feel overcompressed. This way I can apply a weaker sidechaining to those elements while retaining the heavy pump effect on my bass and other heavier elements. For sidechaining, I have a sidechain kick, which is routed to every single bus that needs sidechaining, and a MIDI out setup and ready to go if I should feel like using volume shaper or kickstart instead of the limiters. To set that up, you just load up, for example, kickstart and match the ports. The effects tracks consists purely of audio tracks, as I only operate in the playlist when working on them. By itself, routed directly to the master, I have a sub bass track, which is an instrument track loaded with Citrus. and it's just a single sine wave, which is what I almost always use for my sub-bass, to be honest. I also have the metronome on its own track in case I feel like changing its volume. To set that up, you just go to audio settings and change the preview mixer track to whatever you like. Be aware that this also controls the volume of the sounds you're previewing in the browser. Finally, I have my send tracks. Now, in case you're not familiar with how send tracks work, you can basically duplicate any given signal by routing them to another track. Turning this gain knob allows you to set how much of the signal you want to send. This way, we can for example have a reverb on the send with the mix fader all the way up to 100% without affecting the original signal. This template has 10 send tracks, 8 docked to the right and 2 among the drums. This consists of 5 reverbs, 3 delays, a throw delay and a microshift. All of these send channels are routed to a return channel where I cut the lows and sidechain them. I'm sure most of you know what a reverb and a delay is, but a throw delay has a bit of a different use case. I only use it for transitions. So what I'll do is automate the gain knob to whatever I'm sending to it when I want that effect. Which sounds like this, by the way.
Fall into pieces.
On the mixer track, I have an EQ cutting the lows and highs with a tiny bump in the mids to make it distinct from the original signal. The other effect I have on a send besides delay and reverbs is microshift, which is a plugin from Soundtoys. It works by altering the pitch and delay of the signal over time, which creates an interesting stereo effect.
Fall into pieces.
Setting up send tracks like this feels like a win-win, because for one, you're saving a lot of CPU when you just have 5 reverbs instead of 50. And your track feels more cohesive when you limit yourself to using the same effects on multiple instruments. It makes your elements sound like they exist in the same universe. In the channel rack, I have the 2 instrument tracks I mentioned earlier, 1 synth and 1 bass. The purpose of this is to have something to immediately plot down ideas with. I found myself always opening a synth and a bass when I started a new project, so I figured, why not just have them ready to go? The playlist consists mostly of the same elements as the mixer, things are just slightly different positioned. All tracks are grouped to their respective buses, which makes it easy to switch between views and stay organized. And that pretty much concludes this tour of my template. Thank you for watching to the end of the video. Before you click off, if you enjoyed it, do give it a like and subscribe to my channel, and I promise to bless your feed with great FL Studio content. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, if you're interested in getting your hands on this template and a lot of other goodies for FL Studio, go check out my Patreon page. See ya!